Welcome to lecture 15 of 1413. Today we're going to talk about utility from beliefs. Overall, lectures 15 and 16 are talking about utility from beliefs and learning. While in the previous lecture we talked about attention and sort of the idea that attention might be limited overall, so we might not have the capacity to attend as much as we can, and then sort of we thought a little bit about like, what kinds of things are people paying attention to, and can it be that people systematically attend to the wrong things and miss important things in the world? Today we talk about different deviations from perhaps optimal belief or optimal information acquisition, which is people might derive utility directly from beliefs and therefore have potential incentives to deceive themselves in certain ways. Next time we're going to talk about more about learning and sort of deviations or systematic deviations from Bayesian learning. Okay. So just to summarize, today we're going to talk about utility from beliefs, people directly deriving utility from beliefs, from what they think about the world, about themselves, what's going to happen in the future, or how smart they are, and so on. On Monday, we're going to talk about non-Bayesian learnings. This is the idea that people essentially have trouble being Bayesian learners. Being a Bayesian is quite hard. You may have taken probability theory and so on, and kind of learned quite a bit. But even as a very smart and educated MIT student, there will be Bayesian learning problems that are way too hard. Once you have several variables, lots of information, it's just really hard to do these things in your head, and people might just not be very good at it, and then sort of use heuristics and biases instead. And then after that, we're going to talk about projection and attribution bias, which is essentially that people have trouble predicting how they might feel in different states of the world. If you're hungry, it might be hard for you to not think about being hungry, or think about like how it might feel when you're not hungry. If you're sad, it might be very difficult for you to understand how it feels when you're happy, and so on. And so I should say on Thursday and Friday, tomorrow, you're going to talk in recitation about Bayesian learning, which is sort of like how do economists or statisticians think like you should optimally learn, and what's sort of like the Bayesian benchmark here. And we're going to talk then about on Monday deviations from that. Okay, so the first big picture overview is like, why might people miss information and fail to learn? What are potential reasons why might people do that? Now, we talked about two potential issues already last time. One is very broadly, attention is limited. That's to say, there's so much information in the world that we just cannot attend to everything. Right, and so one specific example was like in attention to taxes, but you could think about like there's lots of different prices in the world. There's just way too much information in the world for you to attend to everything. And so one example that we talked about was in attention to taxes is saying that taxes that are not included in the sales price might be easily missed by people. And we have this very nice paper by Chetty et al. That sort of demonstrated that people are essentially systematically appreciate taxes that they're exposed to, taxes that are sort of, people pay way more attention to taxes that are directly included in the sales price compared to taxes that are only added at the counter. And of course, both of them you have to pay, and so you really should not really underappreciate those taxes because that's just expensive for you. We did not get much into like why are people doing that, but more like showed existence of people seem to be missing those taxes. Then we talked about like reasons why people might systematically, and even in the presence of lots of data in front of them, might not update properly, even if there are in fact Bayesians. And the reason might be that they might have the wrong theories of the world. You might think that certain variables are just not important for your well-being or for any important things in the world. And therefore, you have essentially, since your attention is limited, you will only collect some information, you only attend or focus your scarce attention and memory to what you think is important things in the world. And so now, if you do that, you might systematically miss or not collect the data that would help you sort of essentially improve your theories. And therefore, even in the very long run, even when you get lots of data, you will not update. Notice that that's quite different from rational inattention theories. Rational inattention theories would sort of say, well, people's attention is limited, but they focus attention to whatever they find, whatever is most important for them. So it can't really be that they have like huge losses from lapses of attention, because if they were, then they would sort of direct their attention to something that could be potentially important. In contrast, the learning by noticing paper, the seaweed paper by Hanna et al. That we discussed, provides a reason why people might not pay attention to stuff that's really important for them. And so again, like if your theory says that certain aspects or certain information is not helpful, you will not pay attention to those pieces of information. And if you don't pay attention to those pieces of information, you will never update your wrong theories, and your wrong theory will essentially persist for a long time, potentially forever. We're going to talk now about two other reasons for potentially wrong beliefs. One is anticipatory utility. This is like essentially people like to look forward to good things in the world. Suppose you have a vacation coming up in 6 months from now. You might think about this positive event going forward. Essentially, it's good or bad events in the future that might happen, and you might derive utility from those events already now. Second, there's what people call ego utility, which is people derive utility from thinking that they are smart, good looking, and so on. So essentially, they derive utility from thinking positively about themselves. Now, for both of those kinds of pieces of utility, people now potentially have some incentives to delude themselves and to think that things are perhaps better than they actually are, because that will make them happier. And so then often there's, at the end of the day, there's some trade-off between having overly positive or optimistic beliefs will make people happier. They feel good about themselves. They feel about good things happening in the future. But that may come at the cost of like not preparing or taking wrong actions because people are sort of overly optimistic, right? So one example would be like people might not get tested for certain diseases because they want to think that they're healthy people and want to be happy about their future and look forward to a positive future. But of course, if they were getting tested, that would help them to take optimal actions, potentially medication or any other actions reacting to the potential disease that they may have. And for ego utility, for example, if you always think that you're smarter than you actually are, well, that might make you happy, but at the same time, that might come at some costs, and like you might not prepare properly for some exams or interviews or other things. You might just miss important things that might hurt you along the way. And then finally, the last reason that we might that we'll talk about next week is people might simply just be bad at Bayesian learning. There's no utility from beliefs or the like involved. It's just a lot of the computational issues that we ask people to do are just really hard, and people might be bad at that. And therefore, people use heuristics and biases, and then systematically that most of the time these heuristics and biases are quite helpful and help people making reasonable decisions. But then often these heuristics and biases are in some ways systematically wrong in some cases, and we can sort of then think about some systematic errors, and perhaps there's some ways in which you can improve people's decision makings by avoiding these errors. Now, let's talk about utility from beliefs. So it's important to understand that economists typically define utility functions over outcomes, such as money, consumption, health. Think of these things as like things that people consume one way or other, or things that they can usually measure in some way. So I can look at like, do you have money? And then if you have money, you will spend it on consumption goods. It could be like apples and bananas. Of course, that could be also like haircuts or other services. Or health, for example, I can measure whether you have good or bad health. Usually we think about some outcomes that could be levels of outcomes. So essentially like, 3 apples or 5 apples or 7 apples are the arguments of your utility function. It could be also, as we discussed when we talked about reference-dependent utility, it could be in part being deviations from some reference point or changes over time. But importantly here, the arguments are like goods and services, like essentially are are the arguments of the utility function. Instead, another source of utility could be beliefs about such outcomes. So now it's about like what might happen either in the future or what's happening right now, and you might directly derive utility from such beliefs. Now, such utility from beliefs can be a very powerful source of utility. One example, for example, would be a high-profile public speech. Suppose you have to give like a public speech in front of the entire university. Now, of course, you might sort of derive utility directly from that experience itself. You might like it a lot. You might find it very stressful. So like the 10, 20, 30, whatever minutes, however long the speech is, might be might give you positive or negative utility, but perhaps the utility of that experience itself might be, or could be dwarfed by the stress and anticipation derived beforehand from anticipating it. That is to say, like you might think about it, you might prepare about it, you might like worry about it, you might not sleep at nights. So there might be lots of like stress or positive excitement and anticipation. Every day, if you give a speech like sometime in September, every day until September, you're going to think about it positively or negatively, and you might derive positive or negative anticipatory utility from it. There's another part of utility that we're not going to talk about is utility from memories. So you might afterwards look back and say, oh, that was really nice, and you have a video of it and you really enjoy it and so on. We're going to not talk about that, but that sort of like backward-looking utility could be quite important as well. Now, when you think about utility from beliefs, one way I think is that this is all in your head, but it turns out that utility from beliefs can actually even affect physical outcomes. In particular, there's a large body of research on placebo effects, and which is defined as a treatment that can help patients merely because he or she believes it will. That is to say, if you give people like a placebo or like a sugar pill, something that essentially has no active ingredient, and tell them that this is in fact an effective drug for something, that drug itself relative to control might have treatment effects. Now, that often is the case for things like pain medication of the leg. Usually we think, pain medication, if you give people placebo pills compared to like sort of actual pain medication, these drugs are like about a third as effective as like pain medication, depends of course on the dosage. So that's quite powerful, but then you might say, well, that's only in people's head, and maybe people just say they're happier or less in pain when in fact they're not. There's also some studies that actually found some physical symptoms. So you give people a placebo pill, and there's actually physically, in some measurable ways, hard measures, not just self-reports, people are doing better. So these placebo effects can be, in fact, quite powerful. So when you now think about sort of like overall about sources of utility, it's hard to imagine, in fact, any source of utility that's not influenced to some extent by beliefs. Right? Often it's about like how you look forward to some things. It's not just about going to a restaurant or a date or having like fun with friends. A lot of it is also just the anticipation of that. Okay, so now more specifically, what do we mean by anticipatory utility? So many emotions in particular are intimately linked, related to what a person thinks about the future. When you think about like hope, fear, anxiety, savoring, etc., a lot has to do with like some stuff that might happen in the future, some events that might happen for sure, or some events that could happen and we're just worried about, such as when people are afraid and anxious about certain things. Those are actually things that might happen even with a pretty low probability, yet people right now might be for sure quite anxious or worried or afraid. Now, what is then sort of, how do we define and think about anticipatory utility? Well, it's utility derived now from anticipating in the future. So there's like stuff that in the future enters your utility function directly. And those events that will happen in the future could be consumption, could be also like services, could be also like bad shocks or anything that will happen in the future. Right now, in the current period, you're already feeling good or bad about it, or something that will happen one or several periods in the future. And sort of anticipatory utility is a prime example of utility from beliefs. Now, how might anticipatory utility affect behaviors? You can think about, broadly speaking, two classes of implications that we are going to think about. There's sort of other potential effects that might be there. So the first one is people, if they have anticipatory utility, that might affect the choice of timing of certain outcomes. That is to say, if you have the choice when you can experience a certain good, you might want to delay that or not, depending on your anticipatory utility. For example, if I ask you, would you like to go on a vacation next week or in 6 months from now or 6 weeks from now, you might say, in fact, 6 months from now is preferable, because then you'll have 6 months to look forward to that experience and be really excited about it. Instead, if I say it's only next week, well, then it might be fun to go next week, and maybe, if you're discounting, you'd rather have it earlier than later. But then there's not very much time to look forward to it and to savor and sort of be excited about this experience. So anticipatory utility might affect the choice of timing of outcomes. We're going to talk about this in a bit. Second, and perhaps more consequentially, anticipatory utility also may affect people's beliefs and their information acquisition. That is to say, if there's some things that I look forward to in life, for example, if I think, I'm a healthy person, I'm going to age really happily, and I want to live until age 90 happily or for a long time, well, then, for example, that anticipatory utility might depend a lot on the beliefs about my health status. And now if there were tests or some information that I could acquire, be it about HIV, be it about cancer, be it about Huntington's disease or so very serious potential diseases, people might underuse or acquire such type of information because they want to maintain overly positive beliefs about what's going to happen in the future. And that could be potentially quite important, because if people are not getting, for example, cancer screening, well then some treatments that perhaps could be done very early might be delayed, and that could be potentially quite costly. We're going to talk about this second. Okay, let me show you some motivating evidence of anticipatory utility. This is not so much to establish the existence of such utility, or sort of a very rigorous test and showing exactly this is anticipatory utility and how much of that is there, but rather to get you to start thinking about the patterns of behavior generated by it. So George Lowenstein ingeniously asked undergrads about their hypothetical willingness to pay now to obtain or avoid certain experiences. So they asked them about their willingness to pay as a function of the amount of time until the experience occurs. So all values are normalized relative to students' willingness to pay to obtain the experience right away. So you ask people about how much are you willing to pay for right away, and 24 hours from now, and 3 days from now, and a year from now, 5 years, 10 years from now. And then the willingness to pay right now is one by definition, and everything is relative to that. What are the experiences that you ask people about? There's sort of both pleasant and unpleasant experiences. One of them is receiving monetary gain or avoiding monetary losses. There's obtaining a kiss from a movie star of the student's choice. And there's avoiding a non-lethal but very painful electric shock. And now that sort of, you can think about why Lowenstein asked about hypothetical willingness to pay, because implementing that would be pretty tough to actually do. Now, when you think about these types of experiences, you can think a bit about what would your hypothetical willingness to pay be, and how would that look as a function of the timing? Would it go up or would it go down over time? And there's going to be two forces at play. There's going to be discounting at play, and there's going to be anticipatory utility at play. We talked about discounting already a lot, which is people like to have positive stuff in the present, or rather in the present than in the future. People like to push negative stuff away to the future. So if bad stuff is going to happen, like an electric shock, you'd rather have that 10 years from now, rather than right away. So then the question now is, how does anticipatory utility affect those kinds of choices? And already gave you some of this intuition to start with, which is like if you had a vacation that you were potentially can experience, would you rather have this like right now? Would you rather have it in like a week from now, or 6 months from now, or like 10 years from now? Well, it depends on your anticipatory utility. You might prefer to have it in 6 months from now, because that allows you to look forward to it for quite a long time. You might not want to have it like 10 years from now. That might be good from a perspective of anticipatory utility, but it's really, really far away, and you'd rather have things in the present than in the future. So maybe if you take together like anticipatory utility and discounting, you'd rather have it in an immediate amount of time from now, which gives you the sort of a form of like an inverse U-shape of valuations over time, or valuations as a function of when the right now of a function of what's going to happen in the future. Let me show you what I mean. So when you look at Lowenstein's examples, in particular, the kiss is of the movie star is an example of like an inverse U, where like this is a pleasant experience. And what seems to be the case is that so people prefer that experience to happen in 3 hours, 24 hours, 3 days, and 1 year from now, compared to immediately. You see the values here are always higher than 1, which is sort of what things are normalized to. Sorry, let me back up for a second. What does this graph show? It shows the time delay on the x-axis, which is like immediately 3 hours, 24 hours, 3 days, 1 year, 10 years from now on the x-axis. That's when the actual experience is happening. And on the y-axis is the proportion of the current value. Again, it's normalized to 1, so the valuation immediately is 1. Notice that these are willingness to pay to receive the experience, or willingness to pay to avoid it, so everything is positive. Now for the kiss, now we see that the delay of 3 days from now seems to have the highest valuation, so that people like to delay this for a bit. Notice that like discounting would not generate you this pattern. Discounting would say you kind of want it right away because you really enjoy this experience. So anticipatory utility would say, well, 3 days from now and even a year from now is better, because now you can savor and really look forward to it and be excited about it when that's happening. However, 10 years from now, people seem to like less than right now, presumably because it's really, really far away. So A, I guess you're discounting that a lot, and sort of the experience itself gets discounted a lot. B, you might even like the anticipatory utility might only kick in like 9 years from now, because it's really so far away that like, it's hard to think about this even like because it's so far away. And you might even discount, you might experience anticipatory utility 9 years from now, but you might discount that as well because it's really far away in the future. So it seems like people have sort of some preference for the present. There is some discounting going on, and there's sort of two forces at play, discounting versus anticipatory utility. Now, in contrast, when you look at the shock, the negative shock, here it seems to be that people are really, it seems to dislike having that shock in 10 years or 1 year or from now, compared to having it right away. What's going on here? Well, if you have the shock like in 1 year, 10 years from now, this is really an unpleasant thing that hangs over your head. So what instead people want is they'd rather sort of have it, get it over with right away and not have sort of to think about it too much overall. Now, that's again sort of the opposite of discounting. If you just had discounting, what you would say is, well, rather I'm willing to pay to avoid it if it's right away. It's really unpleasant right away. It's not so bad if it's 10 years from now. So what discounting would say is, the function should be going down as you see it for losing $4. And why is that? Well, losing $4 seems to be like, people rather do that in the future rather than in the present. And it's not really a thing that you think about it. You don't have a lot of anticipatory utility about losing $4 in 10 years from now. That's not such a hugely important thing. However, if you get like an electric shocks in 10 years from now, that might be really unpleasant. So you really don't want to have that in a year or 10 years from now, having this hang over your head for a long time. So you'd rather have it right away to sort of not have to suffer from any anticipatory utility, even though from a discounting perspective, that's actually sort of worse. Okay, and so I already said all of this. Subjects prefer a kiss from a movie star in 3 days rather than now. They also prefer to have a shock now rather than in 1 year or 10 years. Remember, this is willingness to pay to avoid the situation. So like the willingness to pay right now for the shock right now is lower than the willingness to pay in 1 or 10 years. So the curve is going up. Now, this contradicts discounting of any kind. If you think about any discounting, like positive or negative discounting, as in like you might have a preference for the present or preference for the future, you cannot generate these kinds of patterns. In particular, a pattern that's really hard to generate is a pattern where you get sort of these hump-shaped cases where essentially, or inverse U's, because either you want something in the present or really far away in the future. And but as I said before, if you had discounting, what you would get is essentially things are either increasing or decreasing in the time horizon. Positive things you want right away, negative things you'd rather have in the future. And this is not at all what Lowenstein finds. Now, what is a natural explanation? People look forward to the kiss, to the delay to enjoy anticipation, and it's very unpleasant to anticipate the shock, so they get it over with quickly. Now, why did Lowenstein choose the kiss example? You can think about this for a second. Well, it is an experience with high degree of savorability. It's something you can think about and look forward to in the future. Lowenstein tries to rule out alternative explanations based on preparation. You might sort of say, well, kissing a movie star right away might not be great because you want to like get ready, shower, sleep well, and tell all your friends about it, and so on. And sort of there is sort of like or like get some advice on which movie star to pick and so on. So there might be some reason that preparation might push you in 3 days from now. Similarly, if you had sort of sat at dinner at a French restaurant instead, you might say, well, in a few days, his delay is perfectly reasonable, even without anticipatory utility. You might sort of like want to make a time right away. It might not be a good time. You want to get a date, etc., for the dinner. So like choosing stuff later because of preparation seems really reasonable. That's not what Lowenstein is talking about here. He really is thinking about sort of like anticipatory utility. And so he has some other examples where like really he can sort of argue that really this is not about preparation, but part of that could be preparation as well. But when you really think about what's going on, it's really this is about anticipatory utility. When you think about like, is preparation problematic for the electric shock in particular? Well, the answer is no, because that would induce subjects to prefer it later, which is not what Lowenstein finds. Remember, Lowenstein finds that people would like to have the shock right away as opposed to like in a year or 10 years from now. And so preparation would say, well, I want it in like 3 days and a year from now instead, but that's not really what Lowenstein finds. So maybe if you're not happy with the preparation explanation for the kiss of the movie star, preparation will not be able to explain to you the electric shock example. Okay, there's another example. So Lowenstein sort of has this funny thing where he says, well, getting electric shock is kind of a little bit of a weird example. So let me find something more realistic. And then being an academic, what he comes up with is cleaning hamster cages. So he asked subjects how much they'd have to be paid to clean 100 hamster cages. I've never cleaned any hamster cages in my life. I imagine it'd be quite unpleasant. So you think about what kinds of patterns do you expect to see. And what you expect to see is sort of something similar to the electric shock. So people might really not look forward to cleaning hamster cages in like a while from now, and rather sort of do it right away to avoid anticipatory utility. That would be the pattern that people, so like the willingness to pay for avoid it right away, or you'd have to pay them like not so much do it right away compared to having to do it like in a while from now, because the anticipatory utility makes things worse. as it did for the electric shock. And this is what Lowenstein finds. If the payment is now for cleaning to be performed next week, it's going to be like $30. But if the payment is now for cleaning to be performed in a year from now, the payment has to be higher. It's $37. And again, discounting or preparation or the like would sort of create the opposite. People would rather have it in the future than in the present, which is not what Lowenstein finds. Notice again, these are willingness to pay to avoid or to have to do the experience. So how much would I have to pay you to do it? Now, again, there's sort of two forces here at play. There is discounting versus anticipation. Now, how do we think about discounting? So we talked about discounting before, and sort of there are sort of three steps from thinking about discounting, or that we talked about. One was, there was a question kind of like, what determines a person's instantaneous utility at each point in time? We didn't talk about this very much during time preference. We were just saying like, here's an instantaneous utility function that determines like how happy you are at each point in time. What we talked a lot about was like, then how do people integrate or aggregate those utilities across time? So you have some utility today, tomorrow, 2 days, 3 days from now. And we then talked about like, how do you aggregate, how much weight do you put on the different periods? And then we talked about like, what does a person predict about their future utility and behavior, which is sort of the questions about sophistication and naivete that we discussed as well. So as I said, the discounting issues you covered are about point number 2. The sophistication versus naivete issues are about point number 3. And here, people's prediction about their future utility and behavior was only relevant to the extent that it was helpful or harmful in making people, helping people make good decisions. Right, so we didn't care, people didn't derive utility from being sophisticated or naive directly. People only derived utility from their instantaneous utility function and from like or depending on the weight they put on those different instantaneous utilities. But their prediction affected kind of like their choices, and their choices in turn affected their utilities. But it was never the case that people's predictions, their beliefs directly entered the utility function. So instead, anticipatory utility is about point number 1. It's about like the instantaneous utility function, what goes into that, and perhaps people's beliefs about the future might do that. That's what we're going to talk about, what we're talking about now. Now, notice that sort of things like social preferences or reference-dependent preferences, those were also about item number 1. Again, time preferences so far that we talked about were about items number 2 and 3. Now, what are sort of the interactions between anticipation and discounting? We talked about this already. So you can sort of distinguish between pleasant and unpleasant experiences. So, anticipatory utility is stronger for events that are closer in time, right? Something that's like 10 years from now, you're not that worried about right now. For something that's like tomorrow or in 2 hours from now, you might be really worried about. Now, for pleasant and savorable experiences, some delay is optimal to have a few periods of anticipation. So think about like each hour, each day is a period of anticipation. So you'd rather have like 3 days and 2 days than 1 day of anticipation, because each day counts as a day of anticipation and you may value each day. But you don't want it to be too far away, because then there's also like discounting. You'd rather have things in the present or like close to the present than in the future. So you don't want stuff to be like in a year or 2 years from now, because that's really far away, and then you discount that experience very much. Notice that you might also discount the anticipatory utility. That is to say, you might sort of, suppose you have only 3 days of anticipatory utility of like a nice restaurant or some nice experience. Only the 3 days before that experience, you're going to be excited about it. Well, then if that's in 10 years from now, you're going to discount all of that, and sort of then that's really far away. And if you really sort of present bias or just discount a lot, then you only also going to discount the anticipatory utility. So there's some trade-off for favorable, pleasant experiences between discounting anticipatory utility, which might give you this inverse U hump shape pattern. Instead, or in contrast, for unpleasant, fearful experiences, You might either do it immediately to eliminate periods of anticipation. So you might just say, get it out of the way. I don't want any anticipatory utility, and getting it out of the way essentially minimizes anticipatory utility because you just get it over with. Or you might put it off as much as possible for discounting reason and to weaken anticipation. That's to say, let's just do it in 10 years from now. I might not worry about it for quite a while. I might also just discount any future anticipation. And, for discounting, if there's stuff in the future, I'd rather have like bad stuff happen in the future than in the present, because I essentially discount the future, and it's good for me to discount bad stuff that's happening in the future. So far, we talked about the implications of anticipatory utility for the timing of consumption, right? That is to say, when would you like a certain experience to happen, in the immediate present, in a few days, or further away in the future. But we sort of took it as given that something might happen, and then the question was just when. You can think of like some examples where that might be important. Perhaps more important overall for people's welfare decisions, and perhaps also for policy, is people's information gathering and beliefs. That is to say, you might get a situation where like anticipatory or ego utility, as I'm going to show you, might affect how much information people gather, and they might not be as informed as they could be otherwise because of those anticipatory utility reasons. So one question you might sort of ask yourself is, well, would an individual in a non-strategic setting with no anticipatory utility ever strictly prefer to refuse free information? And it's actually hard to come up with some situations where people just would refuse information if they're sort of perfectly neoclassical. You might sort of say, well, people might be overwhelmed. There's like too much information available, and you might not be able to sort of attend to everything. But in general, I think the assumption in economics is, well, the information could be useful for something. Like, you might not even know that right now, but it might turn out that actually is quite interesting information. And in particular, usually the assumption is there's like free disposal, right? If the information is not useful, just forget about it, don't care about it, whatever, just write it down somewhere, and like, whatever, it might be important in the future, but really, why bother not to have it? It's no problem. So you would never like refuse it or directly. You might not like pay for it if you think it's useless, but you would never refuse to actually get it for free. In contrast, somebody with anticipatory feeling cannot ignore information because that information affects his or her emotions, right? If some piece of information makes you really unhappy, well, it's very hard to actually forget about it and sort of ignore it, because once it's out there, once you've heard it, it's really, you can't unhear it, and it's very hard to forget. In particular, it's hard to forget stuff that you really care about, that you're upset about or anxious about, and so on. It's really hard to do. And so one quite interesting example is Dr. House and 13. 13 is one of his employees. She's called 13 because I think he had like 25 or something interns. And I think he fired almost all of them except for 13, who was number 13 of these interns. He never, at the beginning at least, bothered to learn people's names, so he just gave them numbers. So 13 was number 13. She was an excellent doctor. It turns out that her family had a history of Huntington's disease, and 13 had was a prime example of, in the show, of information avoidance. She did not want to learn about whether she had the disease or not. And so Huntington's disease is such that if your parents have the disease, your probability of having the disease yourself is way higher than in the general population. It's about 50% overall if one of your parents have the disease. And so then you might sort of think it's quite valuable to learn about whether you have the disease or not for a variety of decisions that you might make in the future, or that are relevant for the future, ranging from like when to retire, how much to exercise, what education to get, how much to save, whether you have children or not. Dr. House, who's usually pretty irrational in various choices or decisions that he does, was in fact being sort of very neoclassical here, and sort of saying like, you should get this information because it would be very helpful for you. He in fact sort of like behind her back tested her and created and sent her the results. But then 13, at least for quite a while, did not want to look at these results, presumably because she wanted to make herself think that she'll be healthy and sort of delude herself in some ways about like being a healthy person and not having this disease, even though she was not sure. And so so avoiding that information helps you do that, because once you're tested, you're either positive or negative, and it's very hard to ignore that information once you have seen it. But before you have been tested, you can always sort of delude yourself and make yourself think that you don't have the disease. Now, what is Huntington's disease? Let me be a little bit more specific. It's a degenerative neurological disorder. It's a very severe and heartbreaking disease. Essentially, it sort of impacts the brain. It sets on around age 40 and sort of like really makes people very dysfunctional, and life expectancy is around 60 for somebody with Huntington's disease, compared to like 80 or even higher for people who don't have Huntington's disease. People with parents or a parent with Huntington's disease have about a 50% chance of developing Huntington's disease themselves. Since the 1990s, there's a genetic blood test available. And so you can provide at-risk individuals with certainty about whether they will develop it, so you know for sure either you will develop it or you will not. And those lab tests cost about $200 to $300, plus consulting and other costs. The tests here are often covered by insurance, but most tests are paid out of pockets. Emily Oster and co-authors, the paper that is on the reading list, were arguing that people were not doing that partially to keep the test results private. Importantly, there's no cure or nothing that we can actually do to improve the disease. So when you think about other diseases such as like HIV or the like, usually there's a key motivation to learn about whether somebody is positive or negative, because then they can get an antiretroviral treatment or the like. Here, that's not the case. So there's no actually sort of cure or behaviors that you could do that could sort of mitigate the course of the disease. However, there's sort of other potential behaviors that you could engage in to sort of like prepare you better and deal better with the disease once it sets on. So here's what are these reasons? Why could such a test be valuable? Think about this for a second. There's a number of potential reasons that you might think about. I've listed like a few. There's a question about whether or not might you want to have a child. There's issues about like marriage. Would you like to get married or find a partner? Do you want to tell your partner, and so on? There's questions about retirement. When do you want to retire? For example, if you wanted to travel a lot after retirement, well, if the disease sets on at age 40, you might want to sort of do that a lot earlier. Education, usually we think that the returns to education are high, so it's a good news for anybody who's studying, but usually these returns are accrued over a long period of time, right? You're done with the education at the age like 22 or 25, you can then sort of start working from age 25 to age 65 or the like, or even longer. And so that's a long time, but if instead you have Huntington's disease, you might only have until age 40 or 45 or the like, so the returns to education are way lower. You might also sort of do things like participation in clinical research. Perhaps there's like some chance that at some point there might be a cure, you might want to contribute to that and so on. So there's lots of potential benefits of knowing, and that test could really be extremely valuable for you, and surely the value could be higher than $200 or $300. Now, what does the paper by Oster et al. Do? So Oster et al. Observe a sample of previously untested at-risk individuals over the course of 10 years. Why is it useful to have like a sample of at-risk individuals? Well, because the base rate, the rate of people who are not at risk, who don't have any parents with Huntington's disease, that rate is quite low, so not being tested is not so much of a puzzle. If your chance is like 0.00 something percent, then it's really not that. It's quite costly to do. It's $200, $300 plus hassle costs and so on. And there's many diseases one could have. Why test for Huntington's? It's perfectly reasonable to not test for it. But here there are people, these at-risk people, their chances like 50% to start with. So there's a lot to learn from. You go from 50% to either 0% of having it or 100% of having it. So there's huge changes in your beliefs potentially. While if you are a person who's not at risk, your chance of getting it to start with is like 0.00 something percent, with very high chance you're going to go to 0 from that. So that's almost no change at all anyway. And there's only like a tiny, tiny chance that you're actually positive, in which, of course, you might want to change your behavior quite a bit. But the weight on that should be quite low because the probability of a positive test is really low. So Oster et al. Find very low rates of this genetic testing. Fewer than 10% of individuals pursue predictive testing during the study, so over this long period of time. Many individuals get tested to confirm the disease rather than sort of actually learning about whether they have it or not. You might think, what's really important is, for the reasons that I mentioned here, is generating knowledge, right? You want to know, should you retire early or not? For that, you kind of want knowledge. You want to sort of reveal uncertainty. So if you chance to have the disease to start with 50%, going from 50% to 0% or 50 to 100%, that's like huge potential knowledge that's being created. Once you think, the chance is like 99% or 99.9%, going from 99% to 100%, you actually don't learn that much, and you shouldn't change your behavior very much from like confirming that you have the disease. Similarly, actually, there's similar evidence in studies on HIV, breast cancer, and other types of testing. People tend to systematically under-test, even if the chance of like having certain diseases is quite high. Now, what's somewhat different for HIV and cancer, any cancer, particularly breast cancer testing, there's at least some hope that if a disease gets detected early, one can potentially do something about it. There's some recent controversies or discussions on like, is the cancer testing actually helpful, and are we over testing in the sense, is the test actually helpful in detecting potential diseases? But surely for HIV, it would be quite valuable if you knew early on whether you have the disease or not, because then you can essentially take ARB, antiretroviral treatment, to help you. Now, let me show you first like who's getting tested. So what you see on this graph is on the x-axis investigator evaluation of symptoms at the last visit. So on the left, these are people who are normal, who don't show any symptoms. On the right, people have like certain signs of Huntington's disease, and everything else in between is sort of in the middle of that. So like further to the right means like people have like more symptoms. In particular, to the very right, these are people who have like certain symptoms of Huntington's disease. And what we see is on the y-axis, whether people since their last visit get tested, so there's several visits over time. And the raw means are what I wanted you to focus on. This is sort of the upper of those two lines. And what we see essentially that testing rates are like very, very low. The largest are about like 5% in this particular sample. And that's essentially increasing in the symptoms that people have. So overall, that fraction is high. And in particular, for people where you think, the value of testing would be quite high, these are people who don't necessarily show any symptoms, and people who have like some symptoms, but not like very strong symptoms. You would think, for them, it'd be particularly helpful to get tested because you can learn a lot. But instead, those are in fact the people who almost test at all. The test rates are something like 1, 2, 3%. Now, as I said before, for people with certain signs of Huntington's disease, the objective knowledge from the test is very low since there's no cure. You kind of know almost like, you're almost sure that you have it anyway. So in a way, like you just really don't learn very much. If you have these certain signs of Huntington's disease, plus you're sort of genetically predisposed to have the disease, the chance of like actually having the disease is like almost 1 anyway. So the test really does not give you a lot of information. However, perhaps it sort of changes your utilities from beliefs, which I'm going to talk about in a bit. Notice that the perceived probabilities of having the disease might be lower even for people with certain symptoms. So what I'm showing you here is the investigator evaluation. This is like essentially like a doctor, neurologist alike is actually looking at the symptoms and looking at, objectively what's your chance of having disease. That's different from what people actually think they have. So I guess what we learned here is like the testing rates are quite low. Second, people systematically underpredict or are over-optimistic about not having the disease. That is what I'm showing you here is like a motor score, which essentially is like an assessment of like how good are your motor skills. And one unfortunate thing about Huntington's disease is that your motor skills are deteriorating a lot, and sort of a high score means here essentially is bad, means essentially you're not doing well and you're more likely to have Huntington's disease. What you see in the upper on the y-axis, you see essentially the probability, the objective and subjective probabilities of having the disease. The upper line here that you see at the top, that line is the actual probability, sort of the estimated actual probability. And you see that's essentially increasing in the motor scores. So people who have like almost no symptoms overall, they have essentially like a 50% chance of having the disease. That's sort of the risk to start with. But then once people have more symptoms, that chance sort of increases. And once you have a motor score of like in the 20s or 30s, your objective probability of having the disease is close to 1. Now, in contrast, the second line that you see here in the middle, that is the people's perceived probabilities. Those perceived probabilities are vastly lower and far less steep than the actual probabilities. You see that people's perceived probabilities at when they have like no symptoms are still actually reasonably high, and they're pretty close to the truth. They're about 40% compared to like something like 50–55%. So that's actually not that far off, perhaps because it's very clear. If you have a parent who has the disease, everybody knows essentially, in particular in this kind of study, everybody knows that the probability of having the disease is high, and sort of that perhaps people can't really lie to themselves. They know that the chance is pretty high if they have been untested. But then people seem to be largely in denial when it comes to these symptoms. People seem to, people have these symptoms, and when you have like scores of 20 to 30, their perceived probability of having the disease is really only slightly higher. It's about 50% or the like. These are the people who are about here, while the actual probability is much higher. So people don't seem to like update information that's really unfavorable to them in terms of like anticipatory utility, but because they seem to be feeling bad about it. Notice that there's actually a significant share of people who persists and really thinks about or reports saying that there's no chance of having the disease. So there are some people who have like a motor score of like 20 to 30, and they, 10–20% of people here seem to say have a 0 chance of having the disease, which really seems to sort of be unfortunately delusional in some ways. But really, these might be people who really just do not want to think about it and are just really worried and anxious, and they'd rather sort of like rule out that probability of being sick for themselves. Now, one important question then is, well, do individuals adjust their behaviors, right? So far we talked about like, are people getting tested? And the answer is largely no. Second, what are people's beliefs about the disease? And people seem to essentially be overly optimistic. Now there's a question, well, does that translate into their behaviors? And now this is another sort of a little bit complicated graph, but essentially what the figures shows is coefficients relative to those tested negative for Huntington's disease. Let's focus on the black graphs to start with. These are people who are certain to have the disease compared to people who are tested negative. So what we're comparing here is people who tested positive compared to people who tested negative. And so the coefficients, if they're positive, essentially means that people are more likely to get divorced, more likely to retire, more likely to change their finances recently, or their thesis preparation. They're also more likely to be pregnant. So they change essentially their behavior relative to being negative. So it's essentially just comparing positive and negative people. I should have said already, this is sort of a type of setting where experiments are pretty difficult and ethically difficult to do, because if people really derive utility from information, providing people with information could really make them worse off. It's quite different from other sort of experiments involving information when people have like wrong beliefs or sort of biased information about certain outcomes. Usually there, you would say, well, let's provide them with good information and maybe they improve their behavior. So there, if you provide people with correct information, you could only make people better off. Here, however, since people derive utility from this information, telling them the truth about stuff that they perhaps didn't know about could really make them worse off and deeply unhappy. And so one wants to be very careful with that. And therefore, there are not a lot of experiments in this space, at least for now. So the study here that I'm showing you is essentially observational data. And in this case, comparing people who are tested positive, comparing people who are tested negative. If you look at people who are just tested recently, arguably these two types of people are not that different because they didn't when they made the choice of being tested, they didn't of course know whether they were positive or negative. So that comparison really shows that people do adjust their behavior. So people who have been tested positive are more likely to change their lives in pretty dramatic ways. For example, people are more likely to get divorced, more likely to retire, and so on. People are also more likely to have a pregnancy. I think this is might be for women only, or for couples with their spouse. And that seems like an interesting result in the sense that's not what I would have expected. Now, that could be in part, so the authors in the paper itself say that the sample that's used to look at pregnancies is relatively small, so maybe in some sense one needs to be a little cautious in interpreting those results. It could be that people try to get pregnant or have a child when they know about the disease because they want to have a child early on. There seem to be some technologies where people can, in fact, avoid that their child had the disease. So you can sort of make sure that doesn't happen. And there might be some couples who might say, well, even if it's the case that one of the parents will die early on, if the person is like 20 years old or the like, they might sort of want to have the child early so they can spend sufficiently much time with the child before the onset of the disease. But anyway, it seems to be that people, the black lines are sort of like relatively clearly above 0. These are coefficients that compare essentially the black versus the group that's negative, which is so the positive versus negative tested people. Now, when you look at the uncertain people, these are people who essentially with some probability are positive and with some probability are negative. What we would sort of expect is that those people are somewhere in between the positive and the negative people. So you would expect that the gray lines are also positive, perhaps not as big as the black lines. Instead, you see essentially, except for the pregnancy result, and that doesn't seem to be significant, perhaps because the sample is small, the gray lines are essentially pretty close to 0. So essentially, people who are uncertain about the disease behave very similarly to people who are tested negative. So essentially, people who have not been tested, who are uncertain about the disease, they behave as if they were tested negatively, and perhaps or likely because they essentially delude themselves in some ways and sort of like thinking they are negative and there's no action that they need to take. So that really shows, or the authors argue that that shows that essentially the lack of testing really changes people's behavior. Notice that it's very hard for us to think about like welfare, are people better or worse off because of that? Because of course that's a choice to do so. And you might sort of say, well, I'm really valuing thinking about I'm pretty healthy and think life is going to be good. And that's really valuable to people. And they take into account that changes in their finance and so on would be valuable, but they're not doing this because if they were doing it, they would have to acknowledge to themselves that they are potentially at least sick. Okay, so how should we think about these beliefs and behaviors? Let me sort of summarize what we have seen. So many people don't get tested despite arguably good reasons to do so. People are often over-optimistic about the probability of not having the disease, despite often fairly clear signs that they have it. And that really seems to be very much consistent with anticipatory utility. People want to feel good about themselves and about the future, and therefore they're not getting tested, and therefore they're overly optimistic. Such over-optimism then translates into behavior, so people react less to the signs of likely having the disease than they arguably should. In particular, people who are not tested, they look a lot in their behavior similar to people who have been tested negative. And that's to say, like perhaps if they were tested positively, they would change their behavior in ways that could be useful for them, at least along the road. Now, what models can explain such behaviors? It's important to understand, like, neoclassical models would not generate these facts, because you would say, well, you should be tested because that could be useful, and utility is just not, there's essentially no utility from beliefs, so why would you not get tested? You might say, well, it's kind of expensive, but arguably the value of doing so should be quite high. In part, the insurance would also even pay for it if you were not able to afford it. Now, let me sort of write down or show you a simple model. There will be a problem set questions, a question on this model for you to sort of understand it a little better. So the model is extremely simple. It has two periods, and the relevant outcomes occur in period 2. In period 2, the decision maker will either be negative with probability p, so that person essentially would be healthy with probability p and not have the disease, and it will be that person will be positive with probability 1 minus p. The instantaneous utilities of, like, in period 2, how they will feel. Think about period 2 as being like everything in the future. So period 1 is the period when you think about potentially getting tested, which is like right now or this month or the like. And period 2 now is like, say, next year, everything starting from all of the future. Now, the instantaneous utility of this long future period are u minus and u plus. U minus is if you're negative, so u minus is like the good case, and u plus is if you're positive. You sort of think that u minus is larger than u plus. It's better to be negative than positive in that disease or in general. In period 1, we're going to look at now people's choices. We're going to assume no discounting whatsoever. That's just for simplicity. We also assume, for now at least, that nothing can be done about the person's condition. So A, there's no cure. B, there's also no financial or other adjustment that the person might be able to take to sort of mitigate the onset of the disease. For now, we're going to just rule that out. This is just about, like, do you want to find out or not, and why or why not? Now, what would expected utility theory say here? What is expected utility? Well, it's very simple. It's essentially just like there's no anticipatory utility. Expected utility is just what's going to happen in the future. With probability p, you get u minus, which is like the person is negative. With probability 1 minus p, the person is positive and then receives utility u plus. Notice again, there's no discounting. This is in period 2, but then says no discounting. Delta or beta are essentially just 1. Okay, now let's add anticipatory utility to this model. Notice that this type of utility can only depend on the person's beliefs about whether she will have the disease or not on what actually happens, right? So the anticipatory utility depends on the probability of having the disease, and not on sort of the actual consequences of the disease. And since the person in period 1 has this anticipatory utility, doesn't know for sure whether she is going to have it or not, the anticipatory utility will only depend on the beliefs, on the probability p or perceived probability p of having the disease. Now, we're going to make 2 extreme assumptions about the formation of beliefs. Number 1 is beliefs are correct in the sense that, like, the decision maker will always optimally update their beliefs, and once you've given the decision maker like a test, the person cannot sort of just make up their beliefs in certain ways. If the test is positive, the person knows they're positive. If it's negative, a person knows that they're negative. So P is either 1 or 0 once they have the test, or P is correct in the sense of, like, a person knows it's P and there's no sort of wrong information or beliefs about it. Second, the decision maker can choose to manipulate her beliefs. We're going to start with 1, which is essentially the assumption that beliefs are correct. Let the anticipatory utility in period 1 be f of p, and recall that p is the probability of being negative. Now let's assume that, which is kind of obvious in some ways and uncontroversial, that u minus is larger than u plus. So essentially, again, remember, U minus is the probability of being negative. So utility is higher in the second period if you're negative than when you're positive. And then f of p, or f is increasing in p. That's actually not so obvious in the sense it's not obvious that like going from like a certain percentage to a higher one, the anticipatory utility always increases. It's like a reasonable assumption, but one might be arguing about it. But for now, we're going to just assume that f of p is increasing in p. Okay. Now, does the person want to know her status? Well, let's think about this. So if she doesn't find out her status, her utility is f of p, which is the her probability, or without finding anything else is p. So f of p is just her anticipatory utility plus the term that we had before, which is just a sort of expected utility in the future in period 2, which is p times u minus plus 1 minus p times u plus. Now, if she finds out her status, she might find out that she's either negative or positive. If she's negative, that's with probability p. Her utility is the anticipatory part. If she's negative, she just gets f of 1. She knows for sure that she's negative, so she has f of 1 plus u minus in the second period. All of that, again, is with probability p. If she's positive, her utility is f of 0, so her probability of being negative is 0, plus, and then in the second period, u of u plus. Again, that is with probability 1 minus p. So now her expected utility is, putting these things together, is the part here in the back, which is p times u minus plus 1 minus p times u plus. That's what we already had above. That's just the expected utility in period 2. And, p times a negative test, which is f of 1, plus 1 minus p, a positive test, which is f of 0. Okay, and so now if you want to figure out, like, does she want to get tested, we just have to compare 1 versus 2, or 2 minus 1 if you want, if that's the value of getting tested. Notice that the expected utility part, what's going to happen in the future, will always be the same, right? We have pu minus plus 1 minus pu plus. We have that here as well. The reason for that is because we assumed previously that we cannot change the outcome. Right, so that's going to cancel out if we subtract 2 minus 1. So what we're going to be left with is like essentially an expression that depends on f of p times f of 1 plus 1 minus p f of 0. When does she reject or seek information? Well, she's information averse if p of p times f of 1 plus 1 minus p times f of 0 is smaller than f of p. That's exactly, and if you thought that's the case, it's exactly like a concavity condition. If f is concave, that's in fact the definition of concavity. So if f is steeper for lower values, then the person will be information averse. So if the person really dislikes any suspicion of bad news, for example, due to anxiety, there's not much value added of certainty, then the person will not get tested and not seek information. In contrast, that function is convex. That is to say, if it's steeper for higher value, then the person really likes certainty. So some suspicion of bad news is not so painful. That is to say, so essentially, when you think about, like, so if p to start with is something like 50%, what you want to compare is like going from 50% to 100% versus from 50% to 0. And if going from 50% to 100% is more valuable, it sort of like improves your anticipatory ability more than going from 50% to 0% is sort of damaging of p of being negative. That's all confusing in the notation. Then essentially the person will seek information, and it's the opposite if the person really dislikes any suspicion of bad news. And there's no much added value of certainty. Now, that is essentially just a question on, like, what does this f function look like, and one could sort of try to figure out and try to estimate that function. Notice that it's a very simple example here. where essentially the person has to always, there's no self-delusion or self-deception, but like the person always had to like adhere to the truth. Now, consider now instead the possibility that the person can manipulate their beliefs to make herself feel better. Now, one question you might ask yourself is, well, in the above framework, would you want to hold correct beliefs? Is there any good reason to hold correct beliefs? And the answer is clearly no. Well, there's no instrumental reason of beliefs. There's nothing you can, there's no cure. You can't really make anything better. You can't really adjust your behavior by assumption currently. So why would you ever think that you have the disease if you can make yourself feel better by increasing your P? So if she could believe that she's HD negative, for sure, she would get higher utility for whatever happens later, which is f of 1 is larger than f of 0, or f of 1 is larger than any f of p, right? Essentially, f of p is maximized. We assume that it's increasing. It's maximized at p equals 1. So really, in the model that I showed you before, if you could choose your beliefs, there's really no reason whatsoever of not choosing f of 1. Now, when there's a question, well, why might you not want to choose f1 anyway? And of course, the answer is, well, that's because there might be instrumental reason. There might be actually some action that you might be able to take to adjust your beliefs. So in particular, incorrect beliefs can lead to mistaken decisions. You can essentially make worse decisions if you have incorrect beliefs. So, so then there's a trade-off, right? There's a trade-off between, well, on the one hand, if you have incorrect beliefs, if you're overly optimistic, you feel good about it and you're happier than you would be otherwise because you get to enjoy anticipatory utility. But of course, that might come at the cost of like making wrong decisions. So in that trade-off in general, sort of decision-making with anticipatory utility, it's like over-optimism leads to higher utility than realism. That is to say, if you're fully optimizing to start with, like some over-optimism will make you better off because essentially you get sort of the value of over-optimism, and then you're sort of not going to distort your behavior very much if you were optimizing to start with. So in general, you can sort of like show that slight optimism in many cases, in fact, an optimal thing to do, even if it comes at some cost. And of course, the intuition here is that the person wants to believe that she's healthy and it makes her feel better, so she convinces herself that that's in fact the case. Now, optimal expectations essentially then, as I said, trade off anticipatory utility versus the value of knowledge for making correct choices. And then, as I said, overly positive beliefs are an economically important implication of utility from beliefs. So once you sort of assume or think about that there might be utility from beliefs, then, one corollary is that people tend to have like overly positive beliefs, because you explain that with utility from beliefs, because really people have incentives to be overly optimistic, even if that comes at the cost of potentially making worse choices. Next time, I'm going to show you some other evidence of overly optimistic beliefs. And then in particular, we're going to talk about heuristics and biases, which is again, the idea that people might be just be not good Bayesians in the sense that they might not be good at understanding probabilities and how to update probabilities accordingly. Remember, recitation on Thursday and on Friday is going to talk about Bayesian learning. So if you want sort of a refresher on that, that'll be quite helpful, because on Monday, we're going to talk about deviations from Bayesian learning. Thank you very much.